What if everything you've ever heard about Genghis Khan barely scratches the surface of what truly made him the most terrifying ruler in human history? We talk about his conquests, his vast empire stretching from the Pacific to Eastern Europe, his brilliance as a strategist, but almost no one confronts the deeper truth, that behind the legends and the military genius stood a man who engineered fear with such precision that entire civilizations collapsed at the sound of his name. Imagine an empire built not only on horseback and steel, but on psychological domination so overwhelming that people surrendered before a single arrow was fired. What kind of mind designs a system where terror itself becomes a weapon stronger than armies? To understand the darker side of Genghis Khan, you have to strip away the myth and face the machinery beneath it. This wasn't random brutality. It was calculated tyranny, a perfectly structured method of control. Every village burned, every execution ordered, every city erased from the map followed a pattern meant to break human identity at its core. He knew exactly how to manipulate fear, how to turn panic into obedience, and how to force entire populations to accept his rule without ever lifting a sword. This is where the story turns from conquest into something far more unsettling, because when you look closely, you begin to see that his empire didn't grow only through military victories. It grew through the systematic destruction of hope. Picture the world he moved through, dust rising from thousands of hooves, the thunder of riders approaching like a coming storm. Envoys carried messages that were not offers of negotiation, but ultimatums dressed as mercy. Cities were told to surrender completely, or face a fate so horrific that survivors would spend generations whispering about it. And the terrifying part is that Genghis knew exactly how those whispers would work. Fear travels faster than any army, and he weaponized that. Truth, long before modern states understood psychological warfare. The Mongol advance wasn't just physical, it was mental. People surrendered because they had already lost in their minds. What makes this even more disturbing is how he crafted the pattern. First came surveillance through captured scouts and merchants. Then came the testing of resistance through small-scale attacks. Finally came the full execution of terror, designed to send a message far beyond the battlefield. This was not a man acting out of chaos. It was a man building a system, a ruler who studied the weaknesses of human emotion as carefully as he studied enemy fortifications. And the more you examine this system, the more you realize how far he was willing to go to maintain absolute control, not just over bodies, but over thoughts, beliefs, identities. You might wonder how people survived under a ruler who could erase entire cultures in a single campaign. You might even ask yourself whether you would have stood your ground, resisted, fought back, or would you, like so many before, have surrendered to the overwhelming force of a man who mastered the art of fear itself? These are the uncomfortable questions that define this story, because the truth about Genghis Khan is not only about what he did, but why he did it, and how his methods still echo through history. And if this first glimpse into the hidden side of his tyranny makes you question how far power can push the human mind, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Leave a like to help more people understand the weight of this history, and check if you're already subscribed so you don't miss what comes next, as we continue uncovering the darkest layers of his rule, letting this story pull you deeper into the world he built and the shadows it left behind. The deeper you look into the Mongol war machine, the clearer it becomes that Genghis Khan didn't simply use brutality to win wars. He engineered a system where cruelty became a form of governance. This was not impulsive violence or the chaos of a conquering horde. It was methodical, structured, and frighteningly efficient. He turned torture into policy, fear into infrastructure, and obedience into the only acceptable currency. And the terrifying part is how meticulously he calculated every move, studying not just how to kill, but how to shape human behavior through terror itself. Genghis understood that when people fear unpredictable violence, they resist. But when terror follows a consistent pattern, it becomes a language, a message people learn to interpret. So he created rules, invisible but unmistakable. If a city resisted even slightly, he ordered the extermination of its ruling class. If a village delayed surrender, he wiped it out entirely. If a population attempted to hide, he hunted them systematically. The point wasn't simply destruction, it was programming. He wanted future towns to hear these stories, remember these patterns, and obey without hesitation. And most of the time they did. This mechanization of cruelty became one of his most effective strategies. Captured soldiers were often executed in front of their surviving comrades, not out of rage, but to demonstrate that mercy would never be a reward for defiance. Women and children were spared only when their existence served a strategic purpose. Craftsmen were saved to build, scribes to record, physicians to heal Mongol warriors. Everyone else became part of a calculation, reduced to numbers in a system designed to keep the empire expanding without pausing to integrate conquered populations. Genghis wasn't building a world to rule, he was building a world to consume. What made this system so terrifying wasn't only the scale of death, but the efficiency behind it. His generals kept record of every execution, every destroyed settlement, every prisoner categorized by skill. Nothing was left to improvisation. Mongol cruelty did not erupt spontaneously. It unfolded like a series of rehearsed movements. When a city fell, the executions began at dawn and continued until the last living dissenter was eliminated. By nightfall, silence replaced rebellion. And for the survivors forced into slavery, that silence became a lifelong memory of what happened to those who resisted. Some chroniclers wrote that Genghis treated cruelty like a lever he could pull at will. Others described him as a ruler who measured the value of human life the way merchants weighed grain. But beneath these descriptions lies something even more unsettling, the idea that he saw emotional collapse as a strategic victory. Breaking the mind was more important than breaking the body, and so torture, mutilation, and psychological torment became tools as important as bows and arrows. Imagine being a messenger sent ahead of the army. You approach a city knowing that its fate depends on one moment of hesitation. Behind you is a system designed to crush all resistance. Ahead of you are people whose fear hangs thick in the air. You deliver the ultimatum. They look at one another, not wondering whether they should fight, but whether fighting is even possible when an empire has already dismantled the idea of defiance itself. This was the true genius of Genghis Khan's cruelty. It multiplied long before his soldiers even arrived. Stories traveled faster than horses. Rumors became reality. Fear became law. And in that space between truth and myth, he forged a power that no army could match, a power built not only on blades and fire, but on the carefully constructed belief that resisting him meant choosing a death too horrifying to imagine. And as his empire expanded, this system of engineered terror only became more refined, reaching levels that showed just how far a ruler could go when domination required more than military strength, when the human spirit itself became the battlefield, and when the goal was not just to conquer bodies, but to control the very imagination of those who lived under his shadow. One of the most chilling elements of Genghis Khan's rise to unstoppable power was his willingness to erase entire populations when he believed resistance required a message that would echo for generations. These were not battles fought between armies on open fields. These were decisions that transformed entire societies into cautionary tales. He wielded extermination not as a last resort, but as a calculated strategy meant to warp the psychological landscape of Eurasia. And the more you examine the pattern, the more horrifying his precision becomes. City after city learned that surrender might save them. But hesitation, even a moment of it, could mean complete annihilation. When the Khwarezmian Empire misjudged him, believing distance and fortified cities would shield them, they triggered the deadliest demonstration of his philosophy, that a defiant people should not simply be defeated, but removed from the map entirely. Chroniclers describe the fall of cities like Nishapur and Urgench with a kind of stunned disbelief. Entire populations were rounded up, counted, separated by perceived usefulness. Craftsmen lived, scribes lived. The elderly, the weak, the unnecessary, as the Mongol system labeled them, were executed in numbers so vast that surviving witnesses struggled to comprehend them. Genghis understood that statistics alone would never convey the message he needed. Numbers didn't terrify people, stories did. So he created scenes designed to be retold with trembling voices. In some cities, he ordered bodies piled into pyramids high enough to be seen from miles away. In others, he forced surviving prisoners to march past the corpses of their neighbors, imprinting the image deep into their memory. When word spread, it spread not as military news, but as nightmares shared along trade routes, whispered by travelers who had seen extinction with their own eyes. What made these exterminations even more disturbing was the level of organization behind them. There was no chaos, no frenzy. The Mongol armies worked through cities like administrators processing a grim inventory. Every person was classified, measured by value, and assigned a fate. Far from being driven by rage, the soldiers were following protocol shaped to ensure that future cities capitulated instantly. And the result was devastatingly effective. In regions where defiance once burned fiercely, the mere rumor of Mongol banners appearing on the horizon was enough to trigger immediate surrender. Yet even surrender wasn't always protection. Sometimes Genghis used extermination to reinforce loyalty by demonstrating that alliances were conditional and fragile. If a recently conquered city showed signs of revolt or displayed sympathy toward an enemy, he made an example of them with the same merciless efficiency. This unpredictability, allowing mercy one day and delivering annihilation the next, kept newly subjugated territories in a constant state of psychological paralysis. People didn't know if obedience would save them or if they were already doomed, and that uncertainty was its own form of control. To many, these acts seemed excessive beyond any military necessity. But to Genghis, they were part of a greater architecture of domination. He didn't want resistance to be costly. He wanted resistance to be unimaginable. By turning extermination into a strategic tool, he rewired how entire cultures reacted to conflict. Cities that once prided themselves on independence began to calculate survival based on submission, not courage. The Mongol advance became less about battles and more about psychological surrender, where the mere memory of what had happened elsewhere dictated the choices of thousands. And as these stories multiplied, the shadow of his presence grew heavier, making each new conquest easier than the last, and every silent city on the horizon a reminder of how deeply his system of fear had penetrated the minds of those who still dared to cling to their identity. What makes the terror of Genghis Khan even more unsettling is that the violence did not end when a city surrendered. For most conquerors, submission meant safety, a final gesture that halted the coming storm. But under Genghis, surrender was merely another variable in a larger equation, one that determined whether a population would live under Mongol control or be erased to reinforce the boundaries of fear. Executions after capitulation were not rare exceptions. They were calculated demonstrations that obedience did not guarantee survival. And this uncertainty became one of his most powerful psychological weapons. When a city opened its gates, trembling under the weight of stories carried by fleeing merchants or desperate refugees, its leaders believed they were choosing life over destruction. But Genghis viewed surrender through a different lens. It was not a moral gesture. It was a contract, and any breach of that contract, no matter how small, justified absolute punishment. If a single official had insulted a Mongol envoy months earlier, he ordered executions. If locals had killed a scouting party before surrendering, he ordered executions. If he suspected deceit, even without proof, he ordered executions. And these acts were performed with chilling ceremony. Surviving accounts describe how Mongol soldiers would enter a surrendered city in perfect silence, walking through crowds who watched them with rigid stillness, uncertain of what their fate would be. The soldiers then separated the population, isolating certain groups whose social or political influence could threaten Mongol stability. Leaders, scholars, warriors, or anyone perceived to hold authority were often executed swiftly, their deaths staged publicly to show that surrender did not protect those who had once held power. The rest of the population watched, forced into a quiet obedience shaped by terror rather than relief. But the executions did not always end with the leadership class. Sometimes entire sections of a city were deemed unreliable. A neighborhood suspected of hiding rebels, a guild believed to support insurrection, a family implicated in a rumor. The Mongols removed these groups methodically, often in numbers so large that chroniclers struggled to record them accurately. And the message was clear. Surrender was not the end of judgment. It was the beginning of scrutiny. The defeated lived under a constant awareness that any perceived threat, however small, could trigger punishment. What made these executions even more terrifying is how they blurred the lines between justice and domination. Genghis did not hide these actions. He wanted them seen, remembered, and retold. After a city had been pacified, Mongol officers often allowed survivors to walk through the execution grounds, ensuring the memory of what they witnessed would become part of the psychological structure of their lives. This memory shaped their loyalty more effectively than any treaty or oath. They obeyed not because they trusted the Mongols, but because they feared the consequences of being misjudged by them. This tactic spread across the empire like a second shadow following the armies. Cities that heard what happened after surrender began to reconsider whether resistance was even worth attempting, not because they hoped for mercy, but because they feared the unpredictable nature of Mongol judgment. Leaders became terrified of offending the empire in even the smallest way. Populations policed themselves, suppressing their own rebellions before they could form, terrified that the Mongols would return and punish them collectively. And in this atmosphere of dread, the empire expanded effortlessly, propelled not only by force, but by the self-regulation of the conquered. These executions after surrender reveal something fundamental about Genghis Khan's philosophy of power. Domination was most effective when people understood that the rules were absolute, but the outcomes were never guaranteed. A population that lived in fear of crossing invisible boundaries was a population that governed itself, allowing the Mongols to rule vast territories without constantly deploying armies. And this manipulation of fear, this deliberate cultivation of psychological instability, became a defining element of his tyranny, shaping how millions lived under the weight of a ruler who understood that sometimes the greatest control comes from leaving people uncertain of how close they stand to catastrophe. If this darker layer of his methods left you questioning how far a leader could stretch the limits of human fear, share your thoughts in the comments and tell me what struck you most about this part of the story. As the Mongol Empire spread across continents, a different kind of brutality emerged, one that did not rely solely on physical violence, but on the calculated manipulation of the human mind. Genghis Khan had long understood that fear alone could compel obedience, but fear without structure could also breed chaos. So he refined his methods, developing psychological rules of domination that controlled entire populations without requiring constant displays of force. It was here that his tyranny reached a new depth, one where the battlefield shifted from open plains to the private thoughts of the conquered. These rules were not written, but were universally understood. The Mongols cultivated an environment where surveillance seemed omnipresent, even when no soldiers stood in sight. Locals learned that any whisper of dissent, any emotional expression of frustration, any unnoticed gesture could be interpreted as rebellion. And because the consequences were unpredictable, people began to censor themselves, erasing their own impulses long before Mongol authorities intervened. Genghis Khan relied on this internal collapse just as much as he relied on his armies. It saved resources, reduced resistance, and created a society where people lived in a constant state of self-imposed submission. One of the most disturbing aspects of this psychological domination was his systematic disruption of trust. Communities that had once stood united began to crumble under suspicion. When the Mongols appointed local informants, often chosen from among previously respected families, entire populations were forced to question who among them might be reporting their words to. The conquerors. Fear of betrayal spread like a slow-moving poison. Parents whispered differently to their children. Friends spoke only in riddles. Public conversations became shallow, as if everyone was performing the role of a loyal subject, while hiding their true feelings beneath layers of caution. And Genghis Khan understood exactly what this did to people. A population that could no longer rely on one another was easier to control. When individuals felt isolated, the Mongol presence became not only a military force, but the central, inescapable reference point of daily life. Even in regions where troops were scarce, the psychological weight of Mongol rule remained heavy. People governed themselves based on the fear of consequences they had never actually seen but fully believed could occur at any moment. This erosion of trust was reinforced by rituals of symbolic domination. In many conquered regions, the Mongols demanded immediate compliance with new cultural markers. Changes in dress, changes in greetings, changes in social hierarchy. These were not random adjustments, but deliberate efforts to break continuity with the past. When people were forced to abandon practices that had defined their identity for generations, they became more malleable. Their sense of belonging, already fragile under conquest, splintered further. The psychological impact was devastating. It wasn't just bodies being conquered, it was memory, tradition, pride. The Mongols also mastered the art of selective mercy. Sometimes they spared a community that expected destruction, allowing them to continue their lives under strict political surveillance. This mercy was never a true gift. It served as a reminder that the empire could choose life or death on a whim. The emotional confusion this generated, oscillating between relief and terror, kept people compliant. Over time, populations began to adjust their behavior, not just to avoid punishment, but to remain invisible, unremarkable, beneath the radar of a power that watched from far away. But perhaps the most haunting rule of psychological domination was the unpredictability embedded within it. Even those who followed the Mongol codes perfectly felt a lingering dread that some unforeseen event, some forgotten incident, some misinterpreted gesture might bring brutal consequences. This constant vigilance drained entire societies of their emotional strength. People lived in a cycle of anticipation, waiting for something terrible that might never come, but felt always just within reach. And it is in this suffocating atmosphere, where silence became survival and obedience became instinct, that the true reach of Genghis Khan's control reveals itself, stretching far beyond the battlefield into the fragile, unseen corners of human consciousness, shaping not only how people behaved, but how they thought, how they feared, and how they remained trapped beneath a rule that held power not only over their actions, but over their very sense of self. As the Mongol Empire expanded, another layer of Genghis Khan's tyranny emerged, one that blurred the line between survival and servitude. After the chaos of extermination and the psychological erosion of trust, the next phase of domination took shape through the systematic enslavement of survivors. This was not the crude, opportunistic slavery common among ancient empires. It was a meticulously organized mechanism that transformed conquered people into tools of expansion. A captured population became a reservoir of labor, information, and strategic utility, repurposed to strengthen the Mongol world while erasing the remnants of their own. To Genghis Khan, survivors were not merely prisoners. They were resources. Skilled individuals were confiscated with a level of efficiency that resembled administrative sorting rather than wartime improvisation. Artisans were forced into the service of Mongol engineers, building siege engines, repairing armor, forging weapons, or reconstructing captured cities into Mongol strongholds. Scribes, translators, and scholars were used to gather intelligence, interpret laws, and create systems of record-keeping that made the empire more cohesive. Physicians were absorbed into the Mongol medical network, treating warriors so they could return quickly to the battlefield. But for the majority of the conquered, slavery meant something far more brutal. Families were torn apart, redistributed among different military units or noble households, ensuring that no enslaved group remained intact long enough to maintain cultural cohesion or spark rebellion. Women were particularly vulnerable, often forced into domestic servitude or used as political tools to secure loyalty among Mongol commanders. Young men, especially those with physical strength, were conscripted as laborers on long campaigns, carrying supplies across endless distances, knowing they could be executed the moment their usefulness diminished. This transformation of survivors into instruments of Mongol power also served a deeper psychological purpose. By breaking their identities and assigning them new roles within the empire, Genghis Khan ensured that assimilation wasn't a choice. It was a forced rebirth. People were stripped of their heritage, their social structures, their sense of belonging. In place of community, they inherited obligation. Instead of family, they received taskmasters. Over time, many forgot the traditions that once defined them, replaced by the rhythms of labor demanded by their conquerors. One of the most haunting aspects of this system was how the Mongols used enslaved populations in warfare. Rather than simply exploit their labor, they turned them into instruments of conquest. Captured men were sometimes placed at the front of assaults, forced to test enemy defenses or absorb the first wave of attacks. Others were used to carry supplies in dangerous terrain, ensuring Mongol soldiers remained unburdened. Even more disturbing, some enslaved groups were compelled to fight against their former neighbors, transforming victims into unwilling accomplices of their own empire's expansion. In many cases, this forced participation created an emotional fracture that lasted for generations. Survivors who had served the Mongols out of coercion returned to their homelands after campaigns only to find themselves treated with suspicion, guilt, or resentment. Conquered societies fractured even further, divided between those who died resisting and those who lived by serving. This was the brilliance and the cruelty of Genghis Khan's system. By enslaving survivors and weaving them into the machinery of his empire, he ensured that resistance broke not only through violence, but through moral disintegration. People who once belonged to cohesive cultures found themselves scattered, repurposed, and reshaped to fit the demands of a tyrannical expansion. Those who lived carried the psychological burden of survival, often unable to reconcile the roles they had been forced to play. And as these enslaved populations moved with Mongol armies across continents, they carried not only supplies or weapons, but the echo of a world that had been dismantled piece by piece, leaving behind a trail of broken identities that showed just how deeply the empire sought to control not only territory, but the very humanity of those caught in its path. Among the most haunting elements of Genghis Khan's tyranny was his use of collective punishment, a strategy that erased the distinction between guilt and innocence. Entire cities, clans, or families were condemned not because of proven wrongdoing, but because of suspicion, rumor, or the faintest suggestion that someone among them might have defied Mongol authority. This principle, punishing many for the possible actions of a few, became one of the most feared aspects of Mongol rule. A reminder that under Genghis, safety was never guaranteed, even for those who complied. In the early stages of conquest, Genghis used collective punishment to prevent rebellion from taking root. If a city's leaders plotted resistance, even in secret, he ordered the execution of the entire governing class. If a family harbored a fugitive, the entire household could be eradicated, and if a village was rumored to have supported an enemy faction, he destroyed it entirely, leaving nothing behind but ashes and a warning carved into the landscape. These acts were not anomalies, they were policy, a deliberate system designed to instill terror so deeply that no one dared to shelter dissent. What made collective punishment even more terrifying was the unpredictability behind it. Sometimes a minor offense resulted in a small, targeted response. Other times, the same offense led to the destruction of an entire region. The punishment depended not on the scale of the crime, but on the strategic message Genghis wanted to send. His decisions were calculated not for fairness, but for psychological effect. Populations lived in constant uncertainty, never knowing whether the Mongols would treat them with rigid discipline or unleash overwhelming brutality for something they had not even done. To enforce this system, Genghis relied heavily on networks of informants, often drawn from among the recently conquered. These individuals, seeking survival or favor, reported suspicions, rumors, or disputes that might otherwise have remained private. A whispered argument, a dispute between families, a misinterpreted gesture, all could be twisted into allegations of disloyalty. And because the Mongols responded swiftly and decisively, even unfounded accusations carried devastating consequences. Communities fractured under the weight of mistrust, each family fearing that something said in anger or desperation could bring retribution upon them all. When collective punishment was enacted, the process was both methodical and symbolic. Mongol soldiers surrounded the targeted area with terrifying speed, sealing off all routes of escape. People were rounded up, often without explanation, forced to watch as executions began. Leadership figures were killed first, followed by anyone suspected of knowledge or involvement. Entire lineages vanished in a matter of hours. Survivors, if any were left, carried the memory of those scenes into the rest of their lives, repeating them in hushed voices to warn future generations of how quickly stability could turn into nightmare. Even the environment itself became part of the punishment. In some regions, Genghis ordered that farmland be burned, irrigation systems destroyed, or livestock slaughtered. These actions didn't just eliminate the present population, they crippled the future. They were messages carved into soil and memory, reminders that the Mongols could erase not just people, but the possibility of their return. When famine followed, it was treated as another extension of the punishment, a lingering shadow of Mongol wrath. This weaponization of suspicion created a world where fear was inherited. Children grew up hearing stories of families obliterated over a rumor, of villages punished for a crime no one could confirm, of cities wiped away because one influential figure dared to speak too boldly. and over time, populations learned that survival depended not only on obedience, but on silence, on suppressing grievances, hiding emotions, and avoiding any behavior that could be interpreted as dissent. This silence hollowed communities from within, replacing trust with vigilance, unity with caution, identity with survival instinct. And it is in this climate of crushing uncertainty, where a single careless word could doom an entire community, that the full power of Genghis Khan's collective punishment becomes clear. An invisible force shaping the lives of millions, molding them into people who no longer resisted, because they no longer knew if resistance was even thinkable. If any part of this glimpse into his methods resonated with you or sparked a reaction, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Among the most haunting elements of Genghis Khan's tyranny was his use of collective punishment, a strategy that erased the distinction between guilt and innocence. Entire cities, clans, or families were condemned not because of proven wrongdoing, but because of suspicion, rumor, or the faintest suggestion that someone among them might have defied Mongol authority. This principle, punishing many for the possible actions of a few, became one of the most feared aspects of Mongol rule, a reminder that under Genghis, safety was never guaranteed, even for those who complied. In the early stages of conquest, Genghis used collective punishment to prevent rebellion from taking root. If a city's leaders plotted resistance, even in secret, he ordered the execution of the entire governing class. If a family harbored a fugitive, the entire household could be eradicated. And if a village was rumored to have supported an enemy faction, he destroyed it entirely, leaving nothing behind but ashes and a warning carved into the landscape. These acts were not anomalies, they were policy, a deliberate system designed to instill terror so deeply that no one dared to shelter dissent. What made collective punishment even more terrifying was the unpredictability behind it. Sometimes a minor offense resulted in a small, targeted response. Other times, the same offense led to the destruction of an entire region. The punishment depended not on the scale of the crime, but on the strategic message Genghis wanted to send. His decisions were calculated not for fairness, but for psychological effect. Populations lived in constant uncertainty, never knowing whether the Mongols would treat them with rigid discipline or unleash overwhelming brutality for something they had not even done. To enforce this system, Genghis relied heavily on networks of informants often drawn from among the recently conquered. These individuals, seeking survival or favor, reported suspicions, rumors, or disputes that might otherwise have remained private. A whispered argument, a dispute between families, a misinterpreted gesture, all could be twisted into allegations of disloyalty. And because the Mongols responded swiftly and decisively, even unfounded accusations carried devastating consequences. Communities fractured under the weight of mistrust. Each family fearing that something said in anger or desperation could bring retribution upon them all. When collective punishment was enacted, the process was both methodical and symbolic. Mongol soldiers surrounded the targeted area with terrifying speed, sealing off all routes of escape. People were rounded up, often without explanation, forced to watch as executions began. Leadership figures were killed first, followed by anyone suspected of knowledge or involvement. Entire lineages vanished in a matter of hours. Survivors, if any were left, carried the memory of those scenes into the rest of their lives, repeating them in hushed voices to warn future generations of how quickly stability could turn into nightmare. Even the environment itself became part of the punishment. In some regions, Genghis ordered that farmland be burned, irrigation systems destroyed, or livestock slaughtered. These actions didn't just eliminate the present population, they crippled the future. They were messages, carved into soil and memory, reminders that the Mongols could erase not just people, but the possibility of their return. When famine followed, it was treated as another extension of the punishment, a lingering shadow of Mongol wrath. This weaponization of suspicion created a world where fear was inherited. Children grew up hearing stories of families obliterated over a rumor, of villages punished for a crime no one could confirm, of cities wiped away because one influential figure dared to speak too boldly. And over time, populations learned that survival depended not only on obedience, but on silence, on suppressing grievances, hiding emotions, and avoiding any behavior that could be interpreted as dissent. This silence hollowed communities from within, replacing trust with vigilance, unity with caution, identity with survival instinct. And it is in this climate of crushing uncertainty, where a single careless word could doom an entire community, that the full power of Genghis Khan's collective punishment becomes clear, an invisible force shaping the lives of millions, molding them into people who no longer resisted because they no longer knew if resistance was even thinkable. If any part of this glimpse into his methods resonated with you or sparked a reaction, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. As the Mongol Empire pushed deeper into foreign territories, an astonishing pattern began to emerge, one that revealed just how far Genghis Khan understood the Siu, power of terror, as a preemptive force. In many regions, battles ended before they ever began, not because the Mongol armies were unstoppable in combat, but because their reputation alone shattered the will of entire populations. Here, terror became a silent conqueror, advancing ahead of the cavalry, crossing mountains and deserts long before the first scouts arrived. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate strategy crafted by a ruler who realized that psychological warfare could be more devastating than any weapon forged by human hands. News of Mongol brutality traveled with a speed and clarity that defied the geography of the medieval world. Caravan traders described mountains of skulls outside ruined cities. Refugees spoke of massacres so total that no one remained to bury the dead. Survivors shared stories of buildings burned to ash, fields salted with deliberate cruelty, and children executed before their families as warnings. These weren't just accounts of destruction. They were carefully engineered narratives that the Mongols allowed and even encouraged to spread unchecked. Every exaggerated rumor, every whispered tale, every panicked retelling served their purpose. And the brilliance of this strategy was how little the Mongols themselves had to do once fear began its work. In some cases, entire fortresses surrendered without negotiation. Gates opened at the mere sight of dust clouds rising on the horizon. Defenders abandoned their posts, fleeing into mountains or deserts in futile attempts to escape what they believed was an inevitable fate. The Mongols capitalized on this paralysis, sweeping through regions where resistance collapsed under the weight of imagined horrors even more powerful than the real ones. The psychological impact was profound. Leaders found themselves trapped between two impossible choices: risk annihilation by fighting, or surrender and hope that mercy might be granted. For many, neither option felt survivable. In this limbo, unity fractured. Some factions argued for resistance, driven by pride or desperation. Others insisted on surrender, terrified by what they had heard. Communities turned inward, splintering into groups that mistrusted one another's decisions. The Mongols didn't need to sow discord. Fear did it for them. And in this environment of panic, some cities sought to prove their loyalty to the Mongols even before being confronted. They executed suspected rebels, restructured their governments, and sent tributes of livestock, artisans, and even children, hoping these gestures would spare them from the horrors they believed waited nearby. The Mongols watched these displays with calculated detachment, accepting some, punishing others, ensuring that even gestures of submission remained unpredictable in their outcome. Predictability was the enemy of fear. Uncertainty was its greatest ally. What made this terror-driven strategy especially effective was how it hollowed out the emotional foundation of societies. People stopped planning for the future. Festivals ceased, markets collapsed, families buried valuables, preparing for invasion they believed could come at any moment. In some regions, entire economies disintegrated as villagers fled their fertile lands, abandoning crops, homes, and livelihoods. Abandonment became a contagion. Whole towns emptied themselves before Mongol banners ever appeared, turning prosperous regions into ghostly landscapes shaped by dread rather than destruction. The Mongols studied these patterns closely. They knew that terror fed on itself, that fear, amplified through uncertainty, could achieve what swords could not. And so they cultivated this atmosphere intentionally. After conquering a region, they often spared small numbers of survivors before sending them toward neighboring lands, knowing these traumatized witnesses would carry the emotional shockwave forward. These survivors, confused, shattered, and desperate, became unwilling messengers of doom, spreading panic more efficiently than any scout or diplomat. It was in this environment, where imagined horrors merged seamlessly with real ones, that Genghis Khan's empire expanded at its fastest pace. Entire regions submitted without resistance, not because they lacked warriors or fortifications, but because fear had already dismantled their resolve. The Mongols became a storm that often did not need to touch the ground to devastate the landscape. The shadow alone was enough to unravel societies from within, leaving them ready to collapse the moment the first hoofbeats echoed in the distance. As the Mongol Empire reached the height of its unstoppable momentum, the machinery behind its expansion grew so vast and so relentless that it seemed to devour everything in its path. Conquest was no longer merely a goal. It had become a momentum of its own, an engine fueled by fear, discipline, and the ruthless efficiency Genghis Khan had embedded into every layer of his system. Soldiers, slaves, coerced auxiliaries, loyal generals, terrified civilians, and even the land itself became part of this enormous mechanism. The empire advanced not only because its army was powerful, but because everything within its reach was forced to participate in its growth, willingly or not. What made this final stage of domination so haunting was the way the Mongol system continued to function even when Genghis Khan was not physically present. His ideology of control had become a culture, one that flowed through the ranks of his commanders and seeped into the conquered territories. Local leaders adopted Mongol methods to maintain order. Surveillance and suspicion became everyday realities. Tributary states lived in a constant balance, fearful of missteps that could bring retribution. Even distant lands untouched by Mongol hooves watched anxiously, aware that a single political miscalculation could draw the empire's attention. By now, the Mongol approach had evolved into something that resembled a self-sustaining storm. News of their advance pushed populations into panic long before the first scouts arrived. Economies collapsed under anticipation alone. Some cities attempted desperate negotiations, sending hosts of ambassadors with gifts and promises of obedience. But the Mongols evaluated these gestures not with gratitude, but with strategic coldness. A tribute was acceptable only if it reinforced their dominance. Any hint of weakness or hesitation became grounds for punishment. As a result, even sincere acts of peace were overshadowed by fear of misinterpretation. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan's military strategies continued to refine themselves. His generals experimented with new formations, perfected psychological traps, and adapted their methods to every type of terrain. In forests, they used ambushes designed to create the illusion of invisible enemies. In deserts, they manipulated thirst and exhaustion as weapons. In fortified cities, They deployed siege machines built by enslaved artisans who had once lived in the lands they were now helping to destroy. Every tool, every tactic, every decision fed the empire's hunger, pushing it further across the map. Yet beneath this endless expansion was a deeper truth. The empire had created a world where the distinction between conqueror and conquered blurred. Many who fought for the Mongols had once fought against them. Entire populations, once proud and independent, now existed within a system of domination that shaped their beliefs, their fears, and their understanding of power. For millions, the Mongol shadow became an unavoidable part of life, a force that redefined loyalty, identity, and survival. And as the empire stretched across continents, people living under its rule faced a reality that felt both terrifying and inevitable. They watched as distant lands fell with barely a whisper of resistance. They listened as merchants carried fresh stories of horrific punishments, miraculous victories, and acts of calculated mercy meant only to reinforce Mongol authority. They lived with the knowledge that any act of rebellion, no matter how small, could bring destruction on a scale they could not comprehend. The Mongol system did not simply conquer territory, it conquered possibility. It left people unable to imagine a world beyond its reach. This was the final weight of Genghis Khan's tyranny, a world reshaped not only by the battles he won, but by the psychological structures he implanted in the minds of millions, structures that endured long after the dust of conquest settled, long after the smoke cleared from ruined cities, long after his own death. A legacy not carved in monuments, but in the memories and fears of civilizations forced to rebuild under the shadow of a man whose methods pushed the boundaries of domination further than most rulers would ever dare. If you reached the end of this journey with me and felt the intensity of what these stories reveal about power, fear, and the human cost of conquest, feel free to leave a comment saying, "This message was for me." Drop a like if the narrative resonated with you. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the next deep dive. And if you want to continue exploring the darker corners of history, there is another video right here that connects with everything we uncovered, so you can follow the story forward at your own pace.